The ice remembers everything. In the crystalline silence of the Canadian Arctic, 200 feet beneath the surface of Queen Maud Gulf, a ship's bell sits undisturbed. Bronze, perfectly preserved, bearing the inscription HMS Erebus 1813. For 169 years, it waited in darkness. Around it, the scattered architecture of ambition. A brass cannon, china plates still stacked in the galley, a sailor's comb with 3 teeth missing. The intimate archaeology of catastrophe. 129 men disappeared here. Not quickly, not mercifully. The ice kept their story locked away for more than a century, releasing it only in fragments. A grave here, a boot sole there, bones arranged in patterns that suggested horrors the Victorian mind could barely conceive. This is not a ghost story. This is something worse. This is the account of how the greatest maritime nation in history sent its finest men into oblivion, armed with absolute confidence in British engineering and an almost religious faith in the power of civilization to conquer nature. The Arctic didn't care about any of it. May 19th, 1845. The Thames is choked with spectators. Church bells ring across Greenwich as 2 ships, painted black and reinforced with iron, prepare to depart on what many believe will be the expedition that finally cracks the geographical puzzle that has consumed the British imagination for 300 years. The Northwest Passage. The passage itself is almost mythical. A route through the labyrinth of Arctic islands connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, slicing thousands of miles off the journey to Asia. Cartographers sketch it as a simple waterway. Explorers know better. Previous attempts have ended in retreats, frostbite, starvation, ships crushed like eggshells in the ice's grip. But this time, everyone agrees will be different. Sir John Franklin stands on the deck of HMS Erebus, 59 years old, corpulent, a veteran of 2 previous Arctic expeditions and the Napoleonic Wars. He is not the Admiralty's first choice for command. He's considered by some to be past his prime, the man who ate his boots after a previous expedition's desperate retreat. But he has something the younger candidates lack: experience with failure. He knows what cold can do to men. His ships are marvels. Erebus and Terror, ominous names, Greek gods of darkness and fear, have been retrofitted with 20-horsepower steam engines. Their hulls are triple-layered oak sheathed in iron plate, designed to withstand ice pressure that would demolish ordinary vessels. They carry 3 years of provisions, an unheard-of abundance. 8,000 tins of preserved meat, soups, and vegetables, sealed with lead solder in a revolutionary canning process. Libraries of books, a hand organ that plays 50 tunes, crystal glassware, sterling silver cutlery. This is not mere exploration. It's a floating exhibition of British superiority. The crew numbers 129, hand-selected, officers from prominent naval families, common sailors who have survived Cape Horn's fury, an ice master who's read the Arctic's moods for 20 years. They board knowing they might be gone for 3 years, perhaps 4. None imagine they will never return. The last letters home are full of confidence. Commander James Fitzjames writes to his family about the expedition's prospects. "We are now ready with our ships, and everything is exceedingly well arranged." He describes the supplies, the morale, the sense of destiny. There's a schoolboy excitement in his words, the thrill of men about to cement their names in history. The ships vanish into the North Atlantic. For the first several weeks, there's no cause for concern. Arctic expeditions routinely go silent for months, even years. But in August, 2 whaling ships encounter Erebus and Terror moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to clear. The whalers are invited aboard, given a tour of the steam engines, offered tea served on fine china. The officers are in excellent spirits, the crew's healthy. Captain Dannett of the whaler Prince of Wales notes Franklin's optimism. "The ships were magnificent. I have never seen a better-equipped expedition. It is the last time Europeans will see them alive." Years pass. Then more years. The silence becomes oppressive. By 1848, when the ships fail to return, the Admiralty begins to worry. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane, refuses to accept the possibility of disaster. She petitions, campaigns, eventually funds rescue missions from her own pocket. The British public becomes obsessed. Newspapers speculate wildly. Rewards are offered, £10,000 for the crew's rescue, later increased to £20,000. It's the Victorian equivalent of a missing aircraft in the modern era, a technological wonder simply swallowed by the blank spaces on the map. The first rescue expedition finds nothing but ice and silence. Then another, and another. 36 separate missions will eventually search for Franklin, more resources devoted to finding him than to the original expedition. The Arctic yields only fragments, riddles wrapped in frost. Then, on August 27, 1850, 3 graves are discovered on Beechey Island. Wooden markers carved with names and dates. 3 men, John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain, dead in the expedition's first winter. The graves are orderly, proper, suggesting the expedition still maintained discipline, still believed in their survival. But where are the others? Where are the 126 men who sailed away from these graves into the white silence? The answer comes in fragments, scattered across 1,000 miles of ice. April 1854, 9 years after Franklin's departure. Dr. John Ray, a Hudson's Bay Company surveyor, is mapping the Boothia Peninsula when he encounters an Inuit group near Pelly Bay. They have items that don't belong in the Arctic: silver forks and spoons, monogrammed with officers' initials, a gold watch chain, naval buttons. When Ray asks where these came from, the Inuit tell him stories that will scandalize Victorian England. They speak of white men, perhaps 40 of them, dragging a boat mounted on a sledge southward along King William Island 4 winters ago. The men were emaciated, moving like corpses, their mouths stained black. They tried to communicate, but the Inuit couldn't understand them. Later, bodies were found scattered along the coast. Some showed signs of desperate measures. The Inuit are careful in their phrasing, but Ray understands what they're describing. Bones with knife marks, skulls that have been opened to extract their contents. The unspeakable arithmetic of starvation. When Ray's report reaches London, the public reaction is volcanic. Lady Jane Franklin denounces his findings as slander against her husband's memory. Charles Dickens writes furious editorials defending the expedition's honor, arguing that civilized Englishmen could never resort to such savagery. The racism is explicit. Surely the Inuit are lying, or misunderstanding, or perhaps they themselves killed and consumed the explorers. The British Empire cannot accept that its finest naval officers might have eaten each other to survive, but the evidence continues to accumulate. In 1859, a search party led by Leopold McClintock discovers a cairn at Victory Point on King William Island. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, is a standard Royal Navy form meant to record an expedition's progress. 2 messages are written on it, separated by nearly a year. The first, dated May 28, 1847, is routine to the point of tedium. HMS Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in latitude 70 degrees 5, longitude 98 degrees 23, having wintered in 1846-7 at Beechey Island. All well. It's signed by Commander Gore. The tone is administrative, unremarkable, just another winter trapped in ice, nothing the ships weren't designed to handle. But scrawled around the margins of that same paper, dated April 25, 1848, is a second message in different handwriting. The words are cramped, hurried, the penmanship deteriorating toward the end. Ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April. 5 leagues NNW of this having been beset since 12 September 1846. Sir John Franklin died on 11 June 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. F.R.M. Crozier captain and senior offer, and start on tomorrow 26th for Back's Fish River. 105 men, abandoning their technological marvels, setting out on foot to walk south toward a river nearly 1,000 miles away. In April, when the Arctic is still locked in winter, without the ship's shelter, without the steam engines that were supposed to be their salvation, it is a death sentence written in Royal Navy bureaucracy. The note raises more questions than it answers. Why did Franklin die? He was the most experienced Arctic hand among them. Why abandon the ships at all? Erebus and Terror were designed to survive years locked in ice. Previous expeditions had simply waited out multiple winters. Why walk south into one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, dragging lifeboats on sledges, when staying with the ships offered shelter, remaining supplies, and at least the possibility of rescue? McClintock's team finds one of those lifeboats a few miles south of Victory Point. It's mounted on a massive sledge, and its contents paint a portrait of madness. Inside, 8 pairs of boots, 26 pieces of silver cutlery, 5 gold watches, scented soap, silk handkerchiefs, a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, tea, chocolate, and 2 skeletons, one in the boat, one outside it, arranged as if the survivor had been attempting to drag the boat back north, back toward the ships, before finally collapsing. Why are they dragging luxury items across the ice when every pound means the difference between life and death? Why silver forks when they need food? The boat weighs over 600 pounds empty. With all the contents, it requires 10 men just to move it. For what purpose? To maintain the forms of civilization, even as civilization itself dissolves around them. The Inuit testimony continues to emerge, pieces of a puzzle assembled decades after the fact. They describe finding a ship trapped in ice with one body aboard, a large man, likely an officer, laid out properly on a bed below deck. They describe another group of white men at Terror Bay, several already dead, the survivors too weak to hunt. They describe camps with many bodies and the terrible evidence of what desperation drives men to do. But no journals are ever found, no personal diaries, nothing that might explain the expedition's decision-making in those final years. Either they were lost with the ships or destroyed by the survivors, or perhaps never written at all, men too exhausted, too cold, fingers too frostbitten to hold a pen. What the ice does yield slowly is bones. Over the decades that follow, the Arctic surrenders its dead in installments. King William Island becomes a graveyard without graves. The permafrost preserves what it touches, but the surface tells stories in scattered vocabulary. A femur here, vertebrae there, a skull face down in gravel. Search parties in the 1870s and 1880s map these remains like grim constellations. The bones cluster in certain areas: Erebus Bay, Terror Bay, Starvation Cove. The names chosen by cartographers reflect what they found. In 1981, forensic anthropologist Owen Beatty begins a systematic study of the skeletal remains. What he discovers rewrites the narrative of the expedition's demise. Cut marks on bones, not the random damage of scavenging animals, but deliberate, methodical cuts made by metal tools. Long bones split open to access marrow. Skulls showing percussion marks consistent with attempts to access brain tissue. The taboo that Victorian England couldn't speak aloud is written in the bones themselves. The Franklin expedition resorted to cannibalism, but Beatty finds something else, something that might explain not just the crew's final desperate acts, but the cascade of failures that led them there. In 1984, he receives permission to exhume the 3 graves on Beechy Island, the men who died in the expedition's first winter, before anything went catastrophically wrong. The permafrost has turned the graves into time capsules. When they open John Torrington's coffin, they find him perfectly preserved, frozen mid-expression, his eyes still visible beneath half-closed lids. He looks like a young man sleeping off exhaustion, not someone dead for 139 years. He's wearing a striped cotton shirt. His hands are tied together with cloth strips, whether from funeral custom or to prevent some post-mortem movement. No one knows. tissue samples tell a different story than the peaceful appearance suggests. Torrington's body contains lead levels more than 10 times what's considered safe, 240 parts per million in his bone tissue. The other exhumed sailors show similar contamination. Lead poisoning on a scale that would have caused neurological damage, weakness, cognitive impairment, irritability. The symptoms would have felt like illness, like bad luck, like the natural hardship of Arctic exploration. The men wouldn't have known their food was killing them. The source is almost certainly the canned provisions. The revolutionary tinned food that was supposed to keep them alive for 3 years was sealed with lead solder. 8,000 tins, each one leaching poison into meat and vegetables that sat in those containers for months or years before consumption. The Admiralty had contracted a company called Goldner's to provide the provisions, and Goldner had cut corners, using thick lead solder instead of proper sealing techniques, rushing production to meet the expedition's departure date. Quality control was minimal. Some tins arrived already spoiled, bulging with botulism. Imagine the slow realization, if they realized it at all. The weakness they attributed to scurvy, the bleeding gums, the fatigue, compounded by lead's insidious erosion of the nervous system. Officers making increasingly erratic decisions, their judgment compromised by neurotoxicity. Men becoming irritable, paranoid, their higher reasoning functions deteriorating just when they needed them most. The very supplies meant to sustain them were destroying them from within. But lead poisoning alone doesn't explain everything. Modern analysis reveals a perfect storm of failures. Scurvy was inevitable. Despite the 3 years of provisions, the canning process destroyed vitamin C. The Royal Navy still hadn't fully accepted the link between fresh food and scurvy prevention. They carried lemon juice, but not enough, and stored improperly it lost its effectiveness. Within 2 years, the crew would have been suffering from advanced scurvy, wounds that wouldn't heal, internal bleeding, psychological deterioration, teeth falling from gums. Tuberculosis was rampant aboard both ships. Examination of the beachy island bodies shows clear evidence of TB infection. In the closed environments of the ships, with weakened immune systems from malnutrition and lead poisoning, the disease would have spread like fire through kindling. Men coughing blood into the Arctic night, lungs slowly filling with fluid. And then there was the cold itself, not just ordinary Arctic cold, but a period of exceptional climate severity. The 1840 saw some of the coldest years of the Little Ice Age. The ice that trapped Erebus and Terror wasn't unusual pack ice that might break up in summer. It was multi-year ice, thick and unyielding, that wouldn't melt for decades. Tree ring data from the period shows summers so cold that even brief thaws never came. The ships were locked in an icy vise that tightened year after year. The Inuit oral histories, when researchers finally begin taking them seriously in the late 20th century, fill in details that archaeology alone cannot. They speak of meeting survivors who were unable to hunt, men so debilitated they couldn't even fish through ice holes. They describe expeditionaries throwing away items of value, compasses, rifles, suggesting cognitive impairment or desperation. One account tells of finding a tent with many bodies inside, and a single survivor nearby who died shortly after the Inuit encountered him, unable to communicate or accept help. The Inuit knew how to survive in this landscape. They had done so for thousands of years. They could have helped, would have helped, but the cultural gap was too vast. The British expeditionaries, trained in naval discipline and Victorian propriety, couldn't or wouldn't adapt. They dragged their boats south instead of learning to hunt seal. They wore wool uniforms instead of fur. They maintained hierarchy and rank even as it killed them. The Arctic doesn't care about civilization. It only cares about adaptation. For 169 years, the ships themselves remain hidden. They become mythology, ghost vessels that sailed into legend and never returned. Dozens of expeditions search. Millions of dollars are spent. The Canadian government declares the Franklin search a matter of national heritage. The wrecks are somewhere in the labyrinth of channels and islands south of King William Island, but the Arctic is vast and the technology, for decades, isn't equal to the task. Then, on September 1st, 2014, a sonar image appears on a screen aboard the Canadian research vessel Martin Bergman. The shape is unmistakable, a three-masted ship, sitting upright on the seafloor in Queen Maud Gulf, 11 meters of water above it. The preservation is extraordinary. HMS Erebus, after nearly 2 centuries, has been found. The underwater footage that follows is haunting. Remote-operated vehicles glide through crystalline Arctic water, their lights illuminating a vessel frozen in time. The deck is intact. The ship's wheel still stands at the helm. Portholes peer out like empty eyes. In the galley, dishes remain stacked, ready for meals that were never served. The ship didn't sink catastrophically. It settled gently to the bottom, perhaps through a slow leak or damage to the hull, coming to rest as if simply anchoring for the night. What's most striking is how far south Erebus lies from where the Victory Point note said the ships were abandoned. The note claimed they deserted the vessels, 5 leagues NNW of Victory Point in April 1848, but Erebus rests nearly 60 miles south of that position. How did an abandoned ship drift that far through pack ice? Or was the ship not entirely abandoned after all? 2 years later, in September 2016, Terror is found in Terror Bay, the place that bears its name. It sits in deeper water, 90 feet down, also upright, also remarkably preserved. The discovery is almost accidental, located based on Inuit testimony that researchers had previously dismissed. An Inuit crew member named Sami Kogvik mentions his ancestor had seen one of Franklin's ships in Terror Bay decades ago. The search team investigates, and there it is, exactly where oral history said it would be. Terror's condition is even more remarkable than Erebus. Underwater video shows the ship eerily intact, hatches closed, everything battened down as if the crew simply stepped off and never returned. In the captain's cabin, drawers remain closed, possibly still containing papers, logs, perhaps even the journals that could answer every remaining question. But the hatches are sealed, and opening the ship risks destroying what's been preserved inside. The Arctic has kept these secrets locked away for 17 decades. Disturbing them now requires care, time, funding, and technology that's still being developed. The ship's location suggests competing narratives. Erebus, found far south, might indicate someone sailed or drifted it after the official abandonment, perhaps a small crew attempting to reach safety, or the ship breaking free from ice and drifting on currents. Terror, found near where it was supposedly abandoned, suggests a more straightforward desertion. But both ships show signs of having been secured before abandonment. Hatches closed, items stowed, not the chaos of a panicked evacuation. Modern forensic analysis of the remains found on King William Island reveals additional layers to the tragedy. DNA testing identifies several of the scattered skeletons, matching them to crew members through genealogical records. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones tracks the men's diets, showing the transition from European food to whatever they could find in the Arctic, and finally to the period when they were consuming almost nothing at all. One skeleton, found at Erebus Bay and identified as Harry Goodseer, the expedition's assistant surgeon, shows evidence of careful burial. The body was laid out properly, suggesting some level of order remained even late in the disaster. But other remains tell different stories. Bodies left where they fell, bones scattered by time and weather, the markers of complete social collapse. The question that haunts researchers is one of command. Captain Francis Crozier, who wrote the final note at Victory Point, was an experienced Arctic officer, perhaps more qualified than Franklin himself. After Franklin's death in June 1847, Crozier assumed command. He had survived previous Arctic expeditions. He understood ice, cold, survival. Yet the decisions made under his command, abandoning the ships, attempting to walk to the mainland, dragging boats full of luxury items, seem almost suicidal. Was his judgment compromised by lead poisoning? Was he following Admiralty protocols that made no sense in the Arctic context? Or was the situation simply impossible, the ships irreparably trapped, supplies exhausted or spoiled, the crew too sick to survive another winter, and a desperate march south the only remaining option, however futile? The Inuit testimony suggests the survivors fragmented into smaller groups. Some stayed near the ships. Some attempted the southern march. Some may have survived for years, gradually succumbing to starvation, disease, exposure. The timeline becomes murky. Inuit accounts span several years, suggesting Franklin's men were dying slowly in stages across a vast geography. One detail appears in multiple Inuit testimonies: papers. The survivors had papers, lots of them, which they threw away or abandoned. Documents that would have been precious to historians, logs, journals, letters, were jettisoned as useless weight by men trying to survive, or perhaps destroyed deliberately to hide what had happened, what they had done to each other in those final months. The ships might still hold those answers. Somewhere in Terror's sealed captain's cabin, or in Erebus's waterlogged compartments, the truth might wait. The ice keeps its secrets still. Despite the discovery of both ships, despite forensic analysis and underwater archaeology, despite DNA testing and isotope studies, and the careful piecing together of Inuit oral histories, the Franklin expedition remains fundamentally unknowable. We have the where and the when. We have the physical evidence of lead poisoning, scurvy, tuberculosis. We have bones that tell us they died slowly, badly, that some resorted to measures they would have considered unthinkable when they sailed from the Thames with church bells ringing. What we don't have is the why of the decisions, the human moment-to-moment of how 105 men chose to abandon technological marvels and walk into oblivion. The conversations in officers' quarters as Franklin lay dying, the debate over whether to stay or march, the point at which discipline fractured and men began to scatter, the last thoughts of the final survivor, alone in the Arctic vastness, knowing he would never be found. In 2018, Parks Canada conducts a new expedition to Terror. Remote-operated vehicles navigate through the ship's interior, cameras revealing spaces untouched since 1848. The images are uncanny: a table set for a meal that was never eaten, a bottle still corked, a sailor's personal effects arranged in a cubby. In one cabin, shelves remain stocked with items whose purposes are still identifiable. The preservation is so complete that it creates the illusion the crew might return at any moment, might climb back aboard and resume their voyage. But they won't. They're scattered across King William Island, their bones slowly giving up information to researchers who handle them with latex gloves and reverence. Some have been reburied. Others remain in laboratories, still being studied, still offering fragments of the story. The Inuit community, whose testimony was dismissed for over a century, has become central to the ongoing research. Louis Kamokak, an Inuit historian who spent decades collecting oral histories from elders, helped guide searchers to Terror's location. He died in 2018, months after the ship he'd insisted was finally found exactly where his sources said it would be. His work vindicated not just his own research, but generations of Inuit knowledge that Western science had ignored. The oral histories speak of the expeditionaries with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. The Inuit couldn't understand why these men, clearly intelligent enough to build great ships, couldn't adapt to survive. Why they wouldn't abandon their wool uniforms for fur. Why they wouldn't learn to hunt seal. Why they dragged boats instead of building sleds. Why they clung to hierarchy and formality even as it killed them. The answer, perhaps, is that the Franklin expedition wasn't just a geographical venture. It was an ideological one. They weren't just searching for the Northwest Passage. They were proving British superiority, technological dominance, the power of civilization to conquer nature through engineering and will. To abandon that mission, to go native, to adopt Inuit methods of survival, would have been to admit failure before they'd actually failed. so they maintained the forms. They kept their silver cutlery. They wore their uniforms. They followed naval protocol. They died as Englishmen, even when being English was what killed them. Modern analysis suggests that if the expedition had been willing to learn from the Inuit, many might have survived. The Inuit lived successfully in the same landscape that destroyed Franklin's men. They knew how to hunt ringed seals, how to build snow houses, how to read ice and weather, how to dress for sustained cold. They would have helped. Oral histories make that clear. But the cultural chasm was too wide. The British couldn't see the Inuit as equals, as teachers, as anything but savages. That prejudice was fatal. The ships themselves may yet yield more answers. Technology improves yearly. Plans exist to eventually access Terror's sealed cabins, to retrieve whatever papers might remain. But each year that passes, the Arctic asserts itself more. Climate change is opening the Northwest Passage that Franklin died seeking. Cruise ships now sail routes that cost him everything. But that same warming threatens the wrecks, accelerating deterioration, potentially destroying evidence before it can be recovered. There's an irony in that. The passage that obsessed the Victorian world, that sent dozens of expeditions north, that killed Franklin and his men, is finally becoming navigable, not through human engineering, but through the warming of the planet, those industrial societies set in motion. The Arctic is yielding, but at a cost that would have been incomprehensible to Franklin's generation. In the Canadian Museum of History, artifacts recovered from the ships and the search sites are displayed behind glass. A brass button, a ceramic plate, a piece of rope. They look mundane, these objects, until you remember where they've been, what they've witnessed. Each one is a fragment of the last moments of men who thought they were invincible. Final accounting is stark. 129 men lost. Not one survivor. Not one body recovered before the Arctic scattered the remains. The greatest maritime disaster of the Victorian age, and in many ways the most preventable. They had the resources, the technology, the supplies. What they lacked was humility before nature, the willingness to adapt, the wisdom to know when confidence becomes hubris. The ice remembers everything. It remembers Erebus settling to the seafloor, its deck intact, ready for a crew that will never return. It remembers Terror anchored in the bay that now bears its name, hatches sealed against water that seeped in anyway. It remembers bones scattered across islands, slowly being covered by moss and gravel and time. And in the crystalline silence of the Arctic, two bronze bells rest undisturbed in the darkness, waiting, still waiting, as they will wait for centuries more, monuments to the men who sailed into the white silence and became part of it forever.